on. We're just about wrapped up for the afternoon, but we have one more incredibly exciting presenter and someone who I've been looking forward to seeing. Jennifer Laewetz is nêhiyaw, iskwe from George Gordon First Nation and is one of Canada's most fearless Indigenous voices and social media influencers. Jennifer's presentation is raw and insightful and is about dismantling narratives, driving political action, and using platforms to speak truth to power. Please give a very warm welcome to Jennifer Laewetz.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to fix these because I'm not as tall as everybody else. So I'm Jennifer Laewetz, a proud member of George Gordon First Nation in Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, although some of you may know me online as Jennifer L. And over the last few years, I've somehow have found myself being described as a political commentator or social media influencer, which honestly still feels a little strange to hear sometimes. But at the core of it, what you should know about me is that I care deeply about how Indigenous women and our people more broadly take up space in this country and how we grow into leadership and how we shape the conversations that influence the future of our communities. So with that, I want to start by thanking NACA for bringing all of us together because spaces like this do matter more than we sometimes take the time to recognize. You don't often see this many people in one place over several days who are all working in different ways towards the same goal of strengthening our economies and our communities and in turn, strengthening Indigenous prosperity. On my way here, I couldn't help but think about the first time I ever came to Ottawa. It was almost 10 years ago now, and I remember feeling both excited and completely unsure of what I was stepping into. I was young, probably a little naive, and I had big aspirations, some of which probably seemed pretty unrealistic at the time. Mostly because I didn't yet understand the environments that I was walking into or how they really worked. I just knew that I wanted to build a life that meant something, even if at the time I couldn't fully explain what that looked like yet. At that point in my life, I didn't have a lot. I was a young mom living in a small city in Saskatchewan, raising 2 kids, trying to build something stable for them and for my family. There wasn't a clear path laid out and there wasn't a roadmap for where I wanted to go. But what I did have was a really strong work ethic and a relentless desire to learn. And that carried me through everything. It carried me through university while raising my kids, and it carried me into my first real career path, working for a member of parliament, which at the time felt like a huge opportunity. I remember knowing that if I was going to make something of that opportunity, I could not treat it casually. I had to show up, I had to learn quickly, and I needed to be someone that others could count on for the work that was in front of me. I needed to capitalize off of the importance of networking and learning from others. And in return, I gained invaluable experience and knowledge about the very systems and government spaces that we still have to navigate today. Looking back now, I can see that those early years were building something in me long before I ever stepped into what people would recognize as influence. At the time, I would not have described it that way. I was just trying to keep going and do the best I could with what I had. But that is actually how leadership begins. It doesn't start with our titles or our positions. It starts much earlier than that, in the choices you make, in how you respond to pressure, and in how you carry responsibility when no one is watching. And in part of that, if I'm being honest, was a lot of sacrifice. Not the kind that people always see or talk about, but in the kind that shows up in small but consistent ways, and decisions over time. Choosing to stay in and study when it would have been much easier not to, choosing long-term stability over immediate gratification, and choosing to keep going even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain, and at a lot of times it will. Because there's a difference between wanting something and being willing to take and being willing to do what it takes to build it. People often see the outcome, but they don't always see the sacrifice, the discipline, and the uncomfortable moments that lead to it. For me, that sacrifice is what allowed me to buy my first home. It's what allowed me to build a business. It's what allowed me to take care of my family in the ways that they needed. None of that happened all at once, and none of it happened by accident. It was built over time through decisions that were not always easy in the moment, but they did matter in the long run. But I do think we need to be mindful of something else. When we talk about success, especially in our communities, it can sometimes look like it happens with luck, or that it comes without that foundation. But many of our people who are building, creating, and stepping into leadership have often sat with that discomfort. They have made sacrifices that are not always visible. And what's interesting about that is that that is not new. That's something that connects directly to what our ancestors did. They made decisions, often under much harder circumstances that required sacrifice for something that they may not even see in their own lifetime. And because of that, we're here. So over time, another part of my journey became social media, which honestly was not something I ever expected. It really started on TikTok, of all places. During COVID, the pandemic, when we should not be talking about politics, that's exactly what I was doing. And everyone used to say, do not talk about that. Don't talk about politics. Well, I'm going to do it in the most public way ever. But I also used it to talk about Indigenous issues, governance, or things happening in the country that I felt like people needed to understand better. A lot of it came from wanting to make conversations feel more accessible, especially for younger people who were trying to understand how these decisions and structures were actually affecting our lives. And the more I spoke, the more people listened. And somewhere along the line, I also had to learn how to become unapologetically myself. Not in the sense that I stopped reflecting or stopped growing, because I think reflection matters very deeply to us. I've had moments where I've needed to slow down, reassess, and listen more carefully, think critically about how I'm using my voice and the responsibility that does come with it. And my advice to the young people on this is to be coachable and be willing to learn, especially from your mistakes. Being adaptable in today's world is a much needed skill. But I also realized that if I had to change every part of myself to make other people comfortable, eventually I would lose the very thing that gave my voice purpose in the first place. And I think a lot of people, especially Indigenous women, understand exactly what that feels like. To constantly feel pressure to soften yourself, explain yourself, or become more acceptable to other people's expectations. But leadership cannot exist if we are constantly shrinking ourselves to fit into spaces that were never designed with us fully in mind to begin with. But there's a difference between growth and losing yourself. And what started as short videos eventually opened doors I never imagined for myself. It led to regular opportunities with APTN and now CBC Saskatchewan and other media spaces over time, and eventually onto stages exactly like this one. But more than anything, it showed me how powerful it can be when Indigenous people use their voices openly, confidently, and without waiting for permission to participate in conversations that directly affect our futures. Because for a long time, Indigenous voices were expected to fit into these very specific spaces with very specific tones. There was this unspoken expectation that we should be careful, we should be agreeable, and we should be easier for people to digest. And social media changed that in a lot of ways. It gave Indigenous people the ability to speak directly to the broader public, to educate people in real time, to challenge misinformation, and to talk openly about what our communities were actually experiencing without waiting for permission or validation from someone else first. And I think that that shift matters more than we fully realize right now. Because influence today is not just coming from institutions or people in positions of power anymore. Sometimes it comes from people who are willing to speak honestly, ask those difficult questions, and to use our voices in a way that educates at the very same time. The people shaping conversations and creating change today did not get there by accident. Leadership and influence is built over time, often long before people even realize that they're stepping into it. And while a lot of people may know me through social media or public commentary, the reality is that a lot of my everyday work happens directly within Indigenous governance spaces and with First Nations leaders. Over time, I've come to realize that this work is rarely about the projects or the policies that we're building. It's actually about understanding how we operate, how the decisions are made, and what kind of environments we are creating for people to grow within. A lot of my work is also coaching leadership and how to feel the confidence they need to show up every day. Part of that maturity in leadership is being willing to ask very uncomfortable questions and to ask them honestly. Because the reality is that people make mistakes. Leadership structures make mistakes, and we are not immune to that simply because we are Indigenous or because the intentions behind the work may be good. What matters is whether the accountability exists when things go wrong, and whether leadership is willing to respond in a way that is going to strengthen our trust instead of avoiding it. When we talk about economic development and governance and leadership, we are not talking about participation anymore. We are talking about whether what we are building is strong enough to sustain the future that we are actively trying to create. People are looking at leadership a lot differently now, not simply as authority and not just as control, but as something that is grounded in trust and the ability to create real outcomes that people can actually feel in our communities. Within Indigenous governance especially, we are not lacking leadership roles. There are many opportunities for us to step into leadership. The challenge is that leadership development often begins after people have already stepped into our enormous responsibility. And that is why investing in leadership development early on matters so much. We need to invest in people early, in governance education, in mentorship, skill development, and helping our people understand how to carry that responsibility well. Because leaders are not suddenly created the moment someone gets elected or steps into that influence. We are shaped long before that. Our leaders of tomorrow are being built right now as we speak, in classrooms, in homes, in the conversations that young people are listening to, in the examples they see around them, in whether they are encouraged to use their voices or whether they are taught to stay quiet. All of that matters more than we sometimes realize. There are other dynamics that make this more complicated too. Relationships matter very deeply in our communities. They always will. But accountability and strong standards also matter. And I believe we are capable of building environments where the two things can exist together. Because I do not think our communities struggle to identify problems. We are often very aware of what the issues are. What we struggle with sometimes is moving from the conversation into consistent action and meaningful outcomes. Over time, I've also come to understand that strong leadership is not about having all the answers or appearing perfect. The most effective leaders are often the ones willing to listen, to reflect, and to take responsibility when things do not go as planned. And I think that requires both humility and vulnerability. We are also seeing more visibility right now into the challenges within our own governance spaces and into organizations. I've been at the forefront of a lot of those conversations, if you follow me. And those conversations are happening very, very publicly. And while it's uncomfortable, it's also part of our growth, because we're not immune to making mistakes. The question is not whether those issues will come up, but it's how we're going to respond when they do. Whether we use those moments to learn and strengthen what we are building, or whether we spend time defending things we already know are not working. And part of moving forward requires us to be willing to speak honestly about what is happening, even when those conversations are uncomfortable. Not to tear down our own people or our communities, but because avoiding difficult conversations has never been what creates change. And I think part of self-determination also means being willing to strengthen our own governance, our own organizations, and the way we make decisions together. Because if the argument is that we want something better than what has historically been imposed on us, then we also have a responsibility to build something stronger ourselves. I believe that silence can protect ways of operating long after they stop serving in the way that they were meant to. And honestly, I think that willingness to speak openly is part of what gives me hope right now, and part of the reason that I continue to use my voice publicly every single day. Because there's one guarantee that comes with using your voice publicly or stepping into leadership. At some point, people are going to criticize you. It's not a maybe, it's a guarantee. There's a famous quote about the man in the arena, about how criticism often comes from people who are not the ones carrying the responsibility, taking the risks, or putting themselves out there in the first place. And over time, I've come to realize how true that is. If you choose to use your voice, if you choose to lead, if you choose to step into any space where change is happening, there is almost no version of that where everyone will agree with you. That's just the reality of visibility and leadership. And I think learning how to sit with that without losing yourself is also part of the journey. Because younger Indigenous voices are speaking up in ways that we haven't always seen before. People are becoming more engaged, more informed, and more willing to participate in shaping the future of our communities instead of feeling disconnected from it. And to the young people who are finding their voices right now, I also want to say this clearly. The road is not always easy. There will absolutely be moments where people question you, they're going to misunderstand you, they will try to discourage you, and they will try to make you feel like your voice is too much simply because it challenges what people are comfortable with. That is part of the work that is often more important than people are willing to admit. And I think especially for Indigenous women, there can still be an expectation to stay quiet, to make ourselves smaller, and to avoid taking up too much space publicly. I don't agree. The more our people use our voices, the more we participate in shaping conversations. And the more we practice self-determination in real time, the more we begin to revitalize the landscape that exists around us. We become part of something much bigger than ourselves. A stronger, broader movement of Indigenous people who are no longer waiting to be included in conversations about our futures and our communities, because we are already shaping that ourselves. And I think another thing that I've learned through all of that is that you have to be willing to start somewhere. Your voice is not going to be perfect in the beginning. You're going to grow, you're going to learn, you're probably going to look back years from now and realize there are things you would say differently today, and that's okay. I've been there. What happens is that you just start using your voice with purpose. And that doesn't always mean having a large audience or speaking publicly. Sometimes influence looks much smaller and quieter than that. Sometimes it's in the conversations that we have with our children, the way that we're encouraging our young people around us, the way that we're carrying ourselves in our workplaces, our communities, and in our homes. And sometimes, yes, we will grow into larger spaces. But regardless of the size of the audience, I think leadership requires us to remain grounded in what we are actually trying to contribute in the long run. And I think this matters because we do not have endless time to keep repeating the same cycles. Because every moment we spend protecting things that we already know are not working is time that we could be spending building something much better. And that time is not just ours, it's borrowed from future generations. And that's really important for us to ground this all in the reality too. Because while we're here talking about things like prosperity and economic growth, many of our communities are still navigating very real struggles at home at the same time. Just days before coming here, I dropped someone very close off to me at a treatment center. And I often think about how our people are living in this intersection of growth and healing at the same time. We are building businesses, we're leading organizations, we're creating opportunities, and we're stepping into spaces that previous generations fought for us to succeed in and to access, all while still carrying the impacts of trauma, loss, addiction, and survival, sometimes even within ourselves. Even the inner child in many of us is still healing. But I also think part of leadership and part of prosperity is making sure that what we're carrying becomes less for the next generation. Because you know what? My children will never have to grow up carrying the same things that I did. And to me, that's success and that's leadership. That is part of what Indigenous prosperity looks like too, which is why this moment right now matters so much. We are not in a position where we can afford to delay progress or avoid these difficult decisions. The opportunity in front of us is real, but it comes with responsibility. A better future is not something that will be developed on its own. It's built through the decisions that are made between the vision and an outcome. So the question becomes how we build that leadership in a way that's going to last. We need to start building leaders long before they step into leadership roles. And we have to be honest with ourselves about something within our own communities and organizations. When we talk about building leaders, we have to look carefully at who we are making space for and who we are pushing to the margins without even realizing it. Because too often, the people who think differently, the people who ask uncomfortable questions, or who do not follow the expected path end up being labeled as difficult or disruptive instead of being recognized for the leadership qualities that they're actually carrying. And that becomes isolating, especially for our young people. Over time, these patterns will repeat themselves. We lose voices that could have grown into strong leadership, not because they lack potential, but because they did not fit into what we were used to seeing or what made people feel comfortable. If we are serious about the future that we are trying to create, then we need to be just as intentional about building people as we are about building projects and prosperity. That also means being willing to hold each other accountable, not in a way that's we're tearing each other down, but in a way that's maintaining standards and ensures that what we are building is actually working. And I think alongside that, we have to be honest about something else. Leadership in our community carries tremendous amount of responsibility, especially in our nations. But our leadership cannot carry all of that alone. Chief and councils, leadership teams, and the people working within our organizations are often expected to solve every single issue, manage every challenge, and carry the weight of their entire communities on their backs. And while leadership does need to be accountable to the people, prosperity and strong communities are not just built through our leadership alone. They're built collectively. And I want to say something directly to the leadership in this room or to those listening. I see you too. Because the reality is that leadership in our communities is not easy. And I do not think people always fully understand the weight that comes with it. I do not know any other leadership roles where people are expected to navigate political pressure, community expectations, intergenerational trauma, economic development, multiple layers of governance, treaty rights, social challenges, public scrutiny, all at the same time, while trying to hold their communities together through incredibly difficult circumstances at times. And I think it's important to recognize the reality that leaders are operating within is far more complex than most people realize from the outside looking in. If we truly want community-led growth, then as communities, we have to be engaged in that process with our leadership. People need to feel connected to what is being built and to understand that we also have a role within it. Because leadership cannot manage every moment of our lives. At some point, all of us do need to take responsibility for how we're contributing to our communities, how we're supporting one another, and how we strengthen the environments we are leaving behind for the youth that are going to come after us. Because when strong leadership in our communities is also matched with stronger communities, with people who are engaged and willing to work together and towards something bigger than ourselves, the possibilities for our people and our communities then become limitless. And I think it's important that we stop and recognize how much has changed already. Our people are occupying spaces today that previous generations fought incredibly hard for us to have access to. We own businesses. We're lawyers, teachers, nurses, entrepreneurs, journalists, academics, tradespeople, and elected leaders at every level in this country right now. Earlier today, we heard from MP Billy Morin, a former chief who now sits in the House of Commons as a member of Parliament. That matters, because those examples show young Indigenous people that there is no single lane that we're limited to anymore. Our people are shaping the economies. We're influencing policy. We're leading organizations. We're building companies, and we're helping drive conversations across this country in ways that would have been difficult to imagine for many generations before us. And I think sometimes we become so focused on what still needs to improve that we forget to recognize the progress that has already been made. And we should be acknowledging that growth. It reminds us that change is possible and that the work so many people carried before us and are continuing to carry is opening doors for us and for the next generation. But we have to remember to stop and acknowledge the people who helped carry us along the way too. Because rarely do any of us get where we are entirely on our own. There are people actively building us every single day. For me, that's my husband, Bryce, who has supported me from the very beginning in everything that I have chosen to pursue. Even though I'm sure being married to someone as determined and stubborn as I am has not always been easy. And I also think about my grandparents. When I was apprehended as a child, they stepped in and they became the stability I needed during one of the most important times of my life. And I know that I would not be where I am today without them. They taught me the value of hard work and to keeping your word. Qualities I watched firsthand, and I know the importance of today. And to my brother, who celebrated his 16th year of recovery, I am so proud of him and the leadership he shows in his work. And I also like to think we owe acknowledgement to the leaders who are also helping us teach how to become leaders, especially our leaders right now in Indigenous governance across the country. My own community leadership who supported my education, and to the chiefs and leaders I work alongside today, who never just treated me as some young Indigenous woman in the room, but rather as someone with a voice, a perspective, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to the work that they're carrying for their nations. Because strong leadership is not just about building myself or yourself. It's about helping other people grow into who they are also capable of becoming. Because Indigenous prosperity is not just the economics. It's about what is possible when people grow up seeing stability instead of constant survival. When our young people see leadership around them that feels healthy, grounded, and worth believing in. When families are able to focus instead of being in a state of crisis. When our communities are no longer defined only by the challenges that we're facing, but by what we're capable of building moving forward. That's the future I think many of us are actually working towards, whether we say it out loud or not. And I know that none of this is simple. There will be challenges, moments where progress feels slow, and decisions that do not go as planned. But that does not mean that the work is failing. It means that the work is real. It is easy to stand on the outside and to point out what is not working. It is much harder to be in a position where decisions need to be made and responsibility needs to be carried. But that is where leadership exists. And as we look toward the future, I think it's important to recognize both the progress that has been made and the work that remains. Both of those realities can and do exist at the same time. The opportunity in front of us right now is significant. The question is whether we are ready for it. I think we are moving beyond the point of needing to constantly prove that we belong in any of these spaces, because we are already here. What matters is how we lead, how we build, and whether we are willing to take responsibility for what comes next, because the future is not something waiting for us. It is being shaped right now by the decisions we're making, the standards we're holding, and the kind of leadership we choose to build for tomorrow. So my advice today to all of you is go out there and build more leaders. Thank you.